This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I will be speaking with Stephen Tiger. He has a book called Doctrine, Impossible, A Journey from Dogmatic Religiosity to Rational Spirituality, and the conversation will begin in a moment. The topic is Doctrine Impossible. It's a book about going from religiosity to a lack of religiosity. Stephen Tiger is its author, and he joins me. He is the man before you. I'd like to just give him a couple of minutes to explain who he is and why he wrote the book. So welcome, Stephen. And if you could just tell us who you are and what, generally speaking, the book is about, and then we'll delve into it.
Okay, thank you, Dan. I'm a retired medical writer. I spent 33 years writing reports and reviews for the professional medical literature. And I think that background served me well when I addressed this completely different topic of religiosity and spirituality. I was raised with no religion at all, including no hostility to religion. So I had no particular attitudes toward it. I did become interested in it through music, of all things. When I was a teenager, I had started listening to classical music, and one time, out of curiosity, I was listening to a work by a composer I had never heard before, Gustav Mahler, and I was listening to a scratchy old recording of his Second Symphony, and it was like nothing I had ever heard. It was an overwhelming, transformative experience. From the first moment, I was just gripped by it. And it's a very long work, and about close to an hour and a half later, near the end of the work, the music was so overwhelming that I had what I could only describe as a vision, not an actual thing that I saw with my eyes, but nevertheless a vision of the sky splitting open. And I wasn't listening to Bruno Walter conducting the New York Philharmonic and Westminster Choir. I was listening to a cosmic ensemble. I was ecstatic. I was swept away by it. And I started wondering, how is it possible for a mere mortal human being to create such sounds? And I started wondering if maybe there was some realm beyond the physical that the great composers, as opposed to the merely competent composers, could somehow tap into and bring back ideas that they expressed through their art. Well, that was the first time that I had ever thought of things in other than the purely material, physical way. Not long after that, I started learning about some of the teachings attributed to Jesus. And I found quite compelling ideas there too. So at one point, several decades ago, for about 3 years, I attended a variety of Christian churches, mostly Protestant mainstream. And I was trying to see what believers were finding there, what they found there. And I was not looking for proof that what they were saying was correct. I never expected proof, but I just wanted to see, was it possible? Not is it definite, but is it possible? And I found it an illuminating experience. I learned a great deal. And I also learned that what I had thought was confidence and assurance in religious belief is largely dogmatism, dogmatic assertion. I found questions I could not answer, self-contradictions in doctrine that bothered me a lot. And the explanations offered by clergy and apologists were totally unsatisfying. So during that time, I wrote a lot of notes. I was trying to figure it out rationally, kind of like bringing to bear the same thought process that I would bring to scientific writing. Does this make sense? Is this conclusion warranted given the evidence presented? And it was a question of the more I delved into it, the more dissatisfied I became with it. Much later, the notes that I had written to myself trying to figure all this out became the core of the book that I now call Doctrine Impossible, which describes the basic problem. It's not a diatribe against the existence of God. It is an analysis showing that standard church doctrine on sin and salvation is self-contradictory and therefore impossible.
Yeah,
That was,
it's a very
yeah.
even-tempered work. Let me, if I can, pick up on what you said, though, about the music, because one of the things, I'm a writer, and I've been involved in the arts world for 35 or so years, and one of the things that makes music stand out more differently than a lot of other art forms like writing or visual arts, the film, dance, or whatnot, is that music seems to be more emotionally based. Would your assessment, would you agree with that, number one? And do you think that's the power of religion, is that religion bypasses the intellect and goes straight to the emotion?
I think that there are there is an emotional component to the experience of music. Great music cannot be denied. Yes, of course, there is an intellectual component also. If you study music and you look at a work like Bach's musical offering, it is a brilliant work. You can dissect it in an intellectual way. It's delightful, but it's still music. Merely being clever doesn't make for great music. So yes, music certainly has an emotional appeal, and of course, the kind of music that I might find grips me might leave somebody else quite cold. But yes, there's an emotional aspect. As far as religion is concerned, that I think is a little bit different. And the reason is that whereas music appeals to emotions that increase my sense of connectedness to the universe, which, as I'll probably talk about in a little while, is how I generally think of spirituality. It's not a word I like much, spirituality, but for better or worse, I use it. Whereas religion is the diametric opposite of spirituality. Religion sets up walls that separate people into groups based upon what they believe, not what they do, not what kind of people they are, but what they believe. Spirituality is about tearing down those walls so that we see the connectedness. So music gives me a sense of connection. Religion, if it gives people a sense of connection, it's only connection to a kind of a tribal group. And that's not quite the same thing.
When we were speaking or emailing or contacting each other about this interview, I had told you that I don't script questions beforehand, and that I'm going to ask you a question that just came to me, and this is the reason to convey a more natural flow to the conversation. You talk about spirituality, and I know a lot of people who are of a left-minded or liberal-minded political stance often distinguish between religion and spirituality, but I've often found that New Age people who consider themselves spiritual, uh, I don't find much of a difference between that and the standard Abrahamic or even other religions, that they're still divorced from reality. To me, we have the real material world, and then we have everything else that, whether you believe in gods or you believe in Mother Nature or you believe in, Bigfoot or, these kinds of paranormal things, that they are still divorced from reality of a certain sort. You say that you are not particularly fond of the term spirituality, but you seem to be more in sync with that versus religion. What exactly is your, do you believe in a material universe, let me ask?
Oh, yes, we live in a material universe beyond question.
Yeah. Now, you use a term that I don't know if you invented the term or you just have grafted in the book, but it's called bibliolatry. I can parse it down by its roots, but can you explain what you mean by the term bibliolatry?
Yes. First of all, I did not invent the term.
Okay.
In fact, I was taught it. I learned it from a Christian preacher at one of the churches I was attending. He was a progressive-minded young man, and that was the first time I had ever heard it. He referred to it as a form of idolatry. Idolatry has to do with primary faith in a tangible object. It doesn't have to be a golden calf statue, but any kind of tangible object, a physical object. And if the physical object is a book, then bibliolatry, idolatrous devotion to a book, a physical object. And as I've said in the book, the major religions of the world are book-based, they're scripture-based. They take a book, its followers declare it to be sacred and holy, which just means that they associate it with their deity. And that book becomes the focus and determinant of their faith. Now, I want to be very clear. I am not saying that Christians, for example, worship the Bible. No, they do not worship the Bible, but their beliefs about God are entirely determined by and dependent on, and therefore secondary to, their faith in the book. If the book says God is a mass murderer, they will believe it because it says so in the book. They will never say, no, I don't believe that about God, regardless of what the Bible says. So bibliolatry is, it's a key theme in the book, in my book, and it's, as you noted yourself, it's something that I refer to quite often.
Let me, Stephen, jump into the book, and we'll jump around to certain things. I mentioned the term bibliolatry that appears quite often. On page 28, you go off talking a bit about what I would call sort of the pretense of rationality in Christian apologetics, i.e. that, for example, you have here, it says, that Christians and fundamentalists often dismiss evolution as just a theory. Can you give me your take on what I called sort of the pretense of rationality in apologetics? Are you in sync with that term? Does that sort of sum up your views on that point?
Yeah, yes, I think that apologetics represent a huge range of levels of thought, because there is no official board that certifies licensed apologists who have passed the test. I know that there are college courses in apologetics at seminaries, but anybody can basically set up shop as a self-appointed apologist. And in some cases, the apologist is ignorant to an astonishing degree, even about his or her own religion. In other cases, they are quite sophisticated. But there is, in all cases, a kind of pretense of rationality, in the sense that I have not once, in decades of talking, writing, and discussing these topics, I have not once encountered an apologist who faced a question and said, I don't know the answer to that. I can't answer that. What you say makes sense, and I wish I could answer it, but I can't. I have never heard them say that. And the fact that they start with the conclusion that what they believe must be correct is not an actual rational stance.
Yeah. It seems, though, that that kind of belief system, though, is sort of wired into us evolutionarily. I mean, putting aside religion, it seems, or even if you look at modern politics and what's online now, we seem to have very similar things. I mean, you could, whether we're talking about Hillary or Trump or the Russians or the Democratic National Committee, it seems that human beings, if something appeals to them, I guess this gets back to the emotional thing. Emotionally, they will just cleave to it like nothing else, and
Absolutely,
intellect be damned.
absolutely, absolutely. You see, rationality is not for sissies. It's a tough road. It's much easier to sink into a kind of mental moral torpor in which you just accept a pre-given script to follow, a script of words, a script of attitudes. That's easy. And I don't know if it's evolutionary or not, unless in a more general sense that we are evolutionarily designed to take the easy, least effort path. Kind of like physical systems go to their lowest energy level unless you do something to bump them up to a higher energy level. Um, so it's true that politics, like religion, appeal to very similar um, attitudes that people don't want to have to think rationally. They would rather feel certain about whatever it is that they believe, whatever it is their script tells them to believe, than to actually examine it. That's true.
Let me ask you, on page 30, you talk about some things being disprovable. And one of the things you hear from apologists is that you can't disprove God, or you can't disprove a negative. And they make God, their idea of God, be so out of bounds from what we would consider rational thought. For example, God, well, the problem of evil, of course. How can you have an all good God in a universe with evil? And there's all kinds of mental gymnastics that go into that. So you seem to take the idea that things can be disproven. So let me ask, how do you go about rationally disproving God to people who would argue against that?
First of all, I do not try to disprove God.
Yeah.
However, I do disprove the entity that I call Bible God.
Right.
That's the character called God in the Bible.
Yeah.
That character is false. Whether or not there actually is some sort of divine entity in the universe, I don't know. Nobody knows. But such an entity exists. He or she or it is certainly not the very flawed human character called God in the Bible.
Mm-hmm. How about then the historicity of Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, whatever you want to call him? What is your take on that? Do you believe that there ever was a human being, a real human being, whether it was a God or not?
I tend to think yes. I'm aware of the fact that there's no conclusive proof that such a man ever existed, but I have no difficulty believing that there was a reform-minded rabbi of the time who attracted a band of followers, um, who preached the coming kingdom of God, who was looking to reform what he saw as the abuses that had crept into Judaism of that era, and who ended up crucified like many others in that era. Um, so to say that, yes, I can believe that, yes, I can. Whether it's an entirely different question, of course, as to do I believe that he was the Son of God? No.
Yeah. Well, I want to go to page 37. You have a diagram there that I'd never seen before. It's basically a triangular type diagram that has about spiritual consciousness, whereas at the apex of the triangle you have faith and doubt,
Yes.
At the bottom of the triangle, at either end, you have cynicism and dogmatism, and in the mid range somewhere you have what you call spiritual coma. Is that something that you came up with? If not,
Yes,
who? Okay, can you just sort of give a little précis of it?
yes. It was one of the. It was based upon notes that I had taken, as I mentioned, during the years that I attended churches. I was trying to figure out what faith meant. And if I couldn't figure out what faith meant, then maybe I could start by saying, well, what is it not? What is it distinct from? And I started by taking a statement that believers, apologists, had told me often that the opposite of faith is doubt. And I looked into it and I started drawing pictures and diagrams. Um, and I said, no, that's not true. Faith is not the opposite of doubt. And so I finally um, put together that diagram that I included in the book, which you just described, um, in which I realized that faith and doubt are inseparable companions because they both require um, a kind of openness to ideas. Faith is the willingness to trust and believe in an idea without proof. Doubt is the willingness to question such ideas. The opposite of that awake state is cynicism or dogmatism, because those are closed minded states. Cynicism, the refusal to believe, dogmatism, the refusal to doubt. So the real contrast was not faith versus doubt, it was faith, doubt versus cynicism, dogmatism.
Yet you
And
have
that's
yet you
what I
have
tried to say in the diagram.
yeah, yet you have cynicism and dogmatism separated with sort of spiritual coma in between, whereas you have faith and doubt
Oh, yeah,
together.
only in the sense that they look differently from each other.
Okay.
It's not so much spiritual coma in between, but the bottom of the picture represents spiritual coma. And what I describe in the text accompanying the diagram is that if you try to remove faith from doubt, doubt from faith at the top, whatever is left will slide down the hill, slide down that triangular surface. So if you take away faith so that all you have left is doubt, that's going to slide down into cynicism.
Mm-hmm.
The willingness to question will kind of degenerate into the refusal to believe. Similarly, if you take doubt away and leave only faith at the top, it will slide down, and the willingness to believe will degenerate into a refusal to question.
Uh, Let me talk about two terms that we just briefly mentioned here and see if you can connect it. We mentioned and talked a little bit about bibliolatry, and then you'd mentioned the term Bible God versus regular God. Is Bible God an essential part of bibliolatry and vice versa?
Absolutely. Um, the scripture dependent believer does not question that God is the character called God in the Bible. That's the character that I call Bible God, so that we can have a clear distinction between the character in the book versus is there some entity out there in the universe that might be called God. Bibliolatry, by definition, if you have idolatrous faith in a book, and the book says, this is God, this is what God said, this is what God did, they will believe that. And so their faith in the book gives them faith in the character called God in that book.
Bible God seems to have survived past I guess, the initial conception. I guess uh, what was it, YWH, or the unnameable. Uh, uh, when you talk about God, you're actually referring to what I guess some people would call panpsychism, meaning that there's some kind of essential cosmic force or being that is may be uh, a person in the sense that it has an identity, or just could be some force of nature. Is that what you mean when you just refer to God as not Bible God?
In a sense, yes. I don't define um, God, lowercase g, um, in any particular way. Um, I have an idea which is entirely speculative, which I develop in the final part of my book when I'm talking about spirituality. I think of spirituality as connectedness of sentient life, uh, and that's an earthly phenomenon. Um, but I also have a speculative belief that there may be something transcendent above that, more universal, less localized to time and place. So it's possible that there that if there is some kind of cosmic entity that we might call God, it might be related to that, but I make no assertions about that. It is entirely speculative.
Yeah. One of the, I guess I call it logical inconsistencies about quote unquote Bible God has to do with free will. That just like I mentioned before about the problem of evil, that if we have a God that knows everything, consequentially, that God has to know everything that you will do. It will know the mundane thing that, in 3 days, what time you'll get up and brush your teeth, to
Yeah.
the ultimate fate of the universe. And throughout a good portion of the book in the middle, you do spend time talking about free will, John Calvin and predestiny. So let's digress just for a little bit here to talk a little bit less about the Bible and more about the implications of free will versus the Bible God idea.
Well, free will is a topic that fills up volumes of philosophical thought, and I'm not a philosopher. I have what I can only describe as a simple-minded attitude. I believe that free will is real. That places me somewhat at odds with a lot of modern thinking intellectuals who have concluded that free will is a myth. No, I don't think so. Free will to me is a very simple phenomenon. I am capable of choosing to act in accordance with my own inclinations or in defiance of my own inclinations. That's free will to me.
Um, I mentioned Calvin, and you talk about what you call Calvin's five truths, TULIP, TULIP, and you seem rather dismissive of it. Can you just again take a minute or two here, explain what the letters of TULIP mean, and your basic thrust against that?
Well, Calvin was one of the founders or early proponents of Protestantism, um, somewhat different from Martin Luther, with whom we usually associate the Protestant Reformation. Calvin developed his ideas of predestination, which means that mankind is so sinful, so completely sinful, that he cannot in any way do anything to achieve his own salvation. He can't even want his salvation. So it is God who makes the determination of who will be saved. The acronym TULIP, TULIP, is standard Calvinist doctrine. I did not make up that acronym. And in fact, neither did John Calvin. But the tenets of Calvinism were summarized in those 5 points. And they are, if I could recall correctly now, T stands for total depravity. This is the description of humanity that says that humanity, is depraved in every aspect of his existence. Uh, and this to me is the key, the linchpin of Calvinism. The other tenets, the other four tenets, the ULIP, in a sense, all follow from this notion of total depravity. The U is unconditional grace, which means that God's salvation granted by God, is not in any way contingent upon anything that a person does or says or thinks or refrains from doing. It is entirely God's will. This follows from total depravity because a totally depraved individual cannot do anything that would warrant salvation. The L is limited atonement. This is the notion that Jesus did not die for everyone, because then his death would have been a waste for those who are not going to be saved. So Calvinist theology teaches that Jesus' death was only for the elect. It was the means by which God would save those he had chosen to save. The I in TULIP is.
Let me go back here. Page 207. Hold on. I'll get you. 207.
Irresistible grace. Irresistible grace.
Yeah, irresistible grace and then perseverance of the saints is the P.
Yeah. Irresistible grace means that the person chosen by God for salvation cannot resist it. He cannot defy God's will to be saved. He cannot reject salvation. He cannot lose salvation. Perseverance of faith, perseverance of the saints, it's called, is a similar kind of idea. It basically translates in the familiar phrase, once saved, always saved. If you've been saved, you cannot lose your salvation. So these are the five tenets of Calvinist theology that summarized by this acronym TULIP.
It would seem that Calvin liked his followers to be basically zombies.
Well, that was actually more the phrase that would have been used by Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit order, who wanted his followers to display, in his own phrase, corpse-like obedience. Calvin's attitude towards his followers, I can only guess, would be that they are all sinners, they all deserve damnation, but God has chosen them to be saved. That's as much as the theology dictates.
Okay. Well,
now, Calvinism to me is, and as you know, I devoted a chapter of the book to that. It's the nadir of Christian thought, the low point. It is an excruciatingly offensive notion. And the fact that people can find Bible verses that support it mean nothing, because you can find Bible verses that deny it too. You can find Bible verses to support or deny almost anything.
Yeah.
The problem with it is that it makes for an utterly pointless universe. One wonders, well, why did God create people at all, only to have the majority of them damned? If he knows, omniscient God knows he's going to save some people, why didn't he just create those people and save them?
It suggests a God with some psycho-emotional issues.
Well, it's an example really of how theologians and apologists don't think through the ramifications of what they believe and what they assert. One of the common points across Christianity is proselytization. Convert people, make the whole world understand about Jesus and about salvation. But in the Calvinist universe, proselytization is pointless because people can't do anything to save themselves, and God is making the decision anyway.
Stephen, on page 235, you have a section that you talk about the basis of law and morality. I just wanted to ask you how you define morals versus, say, ethics, because oftentimes we hear secular ethics, and ethics is something that evolved from the nature, red in tooth and claw kind of world that is a materialist would espouse, whereas morals seem to have been given by fiat by those who preach about God or gods. Do you make any specific, or do you recognize a specific difference between morals and ethics?
Yes, definitely. As I mentioned at the beginning, I spent my career as a medical writer, and ethics, to me, is the set of standards associated with behavior within a profession. Within the medical profession, physicians are expected to adhere to ethical behavior, that is, a code of conduct specific to their profession. Morality is a quite different kind of animal. The real distinction is not morality versus ethics, but morality versus law. The believer, the religious believer, would say that God gave us laws that we have to follow, and those laws are moral laws. So they actually don't even draw any distinction between law and morality. And they would condemn modern society for allowing, that is, not criminalizing certain acts that they consider immoral. They believe that morality is law, law is morality, and no distinction. I take a completely different view. I think laws emerged from human beings learning how to live with each other in communities, which offered an enormous survival advantage. It became quickly obvious that theft and murder and such were intolerable within a community. So they developed codes of conduct that were required, and these became law. You cannot do that. You just can't. That's illegal. You do that, you'll be punished. There are other kinds of behaviors that some people think are wrong and yet are not immediately lethal or necessarily even harmful to the society. And that's the province that emerged as morality. So we do have laws against murder. But, for example, sexual activity outside of marriage is not illegal, at least in America, at least so far. So that's in the province of morality. Morality, in other words, describes a group of behaviors that some people regard as offensive or wrong, but don't pose an existential threat to society the way that illegal acts do, acts that are so destructive that they have been outlawed.
Well, I mean, of course, just because something's legal or illegal doesn't make it good or bad. I mean, marijuana
Correct.
use, for example, marching with Martin Luther King for civil rights or that kind of thing, they were both things that are illegal at the time, and some places still now illegal. But most people would probably say they're at worst, you know, there's nothing wrong with them, and at best that if that's the law, break it.
Yes, which demonstrates that questions about law and morality are not rigidly defined categories where we have a very clear sense that this belongs in one category and that belongs in the other. Correct.
I want to read a brief section from one of something you wrote in the book, but before I do, I want to preface it with my own idea that came from or is tangent to what you write. I am 54 years old, and in my life, I generally have observed both the cosmos, independent of human agency, as well as humans, that maybe 1% of things that happen in life are good, maybe 9% you could call negative or bad. But most of life, 90% of it or more, is just utterly indifferent to the human experience. Now, I want to go to page 278 where you write, doing good and refraining from evil is not difficult, in fact, for some people. Acting for good is more the rule than the exception. However, most of us would have to admit that we sometimes fail. So, do you have it seems almost that you have a black and white view, good and bad, whereas for me, most of existence is rather indifferent to, it's sort of that gray area of indifference. What is your personal take about? Do you see life in a black and white term, or do you recognize, shades of gray?
Oh, absolutely not black and white. That kind of binary thinking is um, utterly unrealistic, and it is characteristic of heavily doctrinal, scripture-based religion. No, of course I see shades of gray. When I talk about people doing good, people doing bad, um, it doesn't mean that all actions are in one category or the other. Most of the things that we do during the course of our day are quite routine things. They don't have much of a moral component at all. Um, but some of the things we do have moral significance. Uh, and there are people who are conscious of what they do and consciously strive to um, act on behalf of what they consider good, which may not necessarily match what I consider good,
Hmm.
but nevertheless, they try. Other people who take some sort of perverse delight in doing bad things, and some people who just um, don't think about it much at all and do what they do, and sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad.
Uh, on page 297, you have an interesting take on tolerance, where you go, allow me to state my position clearly. Screw tolerance and its imperious attitude toward people who are secretly regarded as inferior. You seem to take the idea that tolerance is a bad thing. I mean, since we all can't have the same opinions about this, that, or the other thing, uh, isn't tolerance a good thing?
Um, Tolerance is a good thing if we define it as I'm not going to hit that person in the face for having a view different from mine. However, the reason I dislike the term tolerance, um, once again, let me go back to my background as a medical writer. The term tolerance in clinical medicine usually has to do with a patient's ability to withstand something unpleasant, a painful condition, adverse effects of a drug, painful sequelae after surgery, something like that. We use the term tolerance, to describe um, something that an individual can withstand, but something that is intrinsically unpleasant, unfavorable. Uh, and I don't like that attitude brought into the question of different beliefs or different political views, different sensibilities. The fact that somebody votes differently than I do, if I have an attitude of tolerance for it, I'm not going to congratulate myself, oh, how enlightened, how tolerant I am, because I didn't punch that person in the face for voting wrongly, in my view. I think that the connotations of the word tolerance are that I view it as wrong, inferior, unworthy, undesirable, should not be. But I'm going to keep a stiff upper lip and say nothing about it. And that's a kind of a snotty attitude. So I don't, I may disagree with the person, and I'll say so.
Yeah.
But I don't like the attitude of smug self-congratulation that is, in my mind, attached to the term tolerance.
Well, let me move on to another term that you take on late in the book that seems also that, for me, has always been kind of smug, and that's the idea that of sufferance. That sufferance is somehow a powerful thing. It reminds me as a kid growing up. I grew up. I wasn't the poorest. I wasn't in the poorest neighborhood. I wasn't the poorest family, but I saw people a lot worse off than me. And you hear how, oh, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Poverty can do good things, and anyone who's really been poor knows that's utter bullshit. What is your take on sufferance? It seems to me that's wielded much in the same way that politically the necessity of poverty is good, because there was someone who once said, you know, if the poor if the poor didn't ever got better, they would lose the drive to make themselves better. You know, if the poor had more money, you know, that somehow this spurs you on to greater and higher things that you would not otherwise do. So what's your take on sufferance?
Well, the word I use, I believe, is suffering.
Yeah, suffering.
Yeah. I don't see any intrinsic virtue or benefit from suffering. I don't subscribe to the notion that suffering builds character. I think that challenge can build character. Suffering, I think, is something that should be relieved. And that applies not just to the human condition, but interestingly, perhaps, this circles back to what we were talking about earlier in my views about spirituality, which to me is the connecting web of sentient life. I don't want to see any sentient beings suffering. Suffering is not a good state. Suffering should be relieved. The utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, in talking about animals, rejected notions that, well, they don't matter because they can't think, they can't talk, they can't write, they don't have human civilization. And he said, that's not the issue. It's not a question of whether they can think, but can they suffer?
Yeah.
That was to him was the basis of compassion. Compassion is kind of like the real life expression of connectedness, of the desire to relieve suffering, to not cause suffering. I don't see any kind of benefit in suffering. It's true that some people have come through very difficult, painful experiences and have emerged stronger for it, and more power to them. That's wonderful. But it's not that I think that is a recommended way to become a better person.
Yeah, because then you get these absurd things that, well, if she hadn't been raped, if he hadn't survived the death camps or whatnot, he wouldn't be the man or the woman that she is today. And that's
Exactly.
like ridiculous.
It's offensive, yes.
Yeah. Towards the end of the book, you use two terms: cosmic mindfulness, that seems to be sort of a substitute for the idea of God, not Bible God, but God, and then omega point, which brings me to mind. I think it was Frank Tipler who came up with the sort of the scientific idea of an omega point. So, can you define those two terms and how you reckon them in the book?
Yeah, to take the latter one first, I believe that the term omega point was first used um, by Teilhard de Chardin, the French scientist and philosopher. And he described, and yes, Frank Tipler, who was a mathematical physicist, developed similar ideas um, in some of his books. I read one of his books, which was quite a difficult read for me. Um, Omega point, as Teilhard de Chardin um, described it, as he used the term, refers to um, kind of like the end of evolution of the entire universe, the focal point towards which existence is directed. He identified it, and he was a Christian, a very solid devout believer. He believed in what he called the cosmic Christ, not the human being who lived 2,000 years ago, but um, an aspect of the divine, a manifestation of the divine, towards which all of existence is directed and pointed. So that was the term cosmic Christ. And it's worth mentioning that certainly not everybody agreed with Teilhard and his view of that. There was a scientist, I believe his name was Medawar, who was, I think, an immunologist, a renowned scientist, who despised Teilhard's vision and wrote a quite savage rebuttal to it. He didn't prove that Teilhard was wrong, but simply that he was making totally unfounded assertions. Um, I I think that I find much that I agree with, or that resonates within me, I should say, from Teilhard's thoughts, and I appreciate Medawar's um, uh, hard-nosed critique of it, because I would never want to say yes, this is true, because we don't know. There's no way to know this. This is all speculation. But there are speculations that can resonate within us and say, yeah, that sounds right. I can't prove it. I don't know. There's no evidence, but it just sounds right. Or maybe it sounds wrong to some other people. So that was Cosmic Christ, Teilhard's vision of the end point of evolution, not just biological evolution, but the evolution of the entire universe coming to this kind of focal point that it was directed at. Cosmic mindfulness is the phrase that I use in my book. I mentioned earlier that my view of spirituality, and let me add, by the way, not to be confused with spiritualism, which is belief in ghosts and communicating with ghosts, but spirituality, which I see as the connectedness of all sentient life. I think that that's not at all a supernatural phenomenon. I think it's a natural phenomenon, but the mechanism by which it happens, I have no idea. It doesn't seem to be anything that can be physically detected, or at least not now. Um, but I don't regard it as supernatural. Um, I also mentioned earlier that I have a more speculative, an entirely speculative notion about cosmic mindfulness, and the relationship between cosmic mindfulness and spirituality, in my mind, is that perhaps all sentient life being connected. Imagine a network of interconnected devices, say like computer terminals. Now envision that same system, but with a central processing unit that all outgoing messages from each unit go to the central unit, and the central unit then conveys all those messages it receives out to all the other units, out to all units. So it is kind of like the mechanism of interconnectedness, a kind of a central exchange of ideas. Again, I hasten to add, I'm not saying this is true. It's just an idea. And then that central unit receiving the input of all sentient life would know everything. Is that not omniscience? And in sending or conveying back all information to all sentient life is influencing the behavior of all sentient life, not controlling, but providing input that is an influencing factor. That's a kind of omniscience. I'm sorry, a kind of omnipotence. And if, as I further believe, that the basic quality of cosmic mindfulness is toward things that are good, is that not omnibenevolence? So there are these characteristics, omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, that we associate with God, but we can still construe God as a person, a man, a magician in the sky, pulling the strings of life on earth. No, that's nonsense. But maybe there is a cosmic mindfulness that represents the entire thoughts and knowledge and experiences of all life that has ever been, all life that ever will be, all sentient life that ever will be. So that's what I refer to as cosmic mindfulness. It is not an assertion. I'm not saying it's true. It's just an idea that I have.
And that gets back to the idea of panpsychism that I mentioned. A lot of people who believe that there's some kind of essence within all things, you know, a boulder, a weed, a man, some alien creature, you know, a billion light years away on another planet, that they have, you know, that kind of essential thing, whatever it might be. Let me get back, though, towards what I would opened up talking about the connection between religion and emotions here, because you had mentioned that you're retired, and that means you're probably in your 60s or maybe 70s, and you certainly are going to be aware of your mortality more than a 20-year-old, more than myself, who's 54, although I'm very much aware of my own mortality and have been since childhood. What then, with all of your own personal beliefs and your years of studying, I guess, the Abrahamic religions and other things, what is your own personal belief? Do you think that when, in whatever cause, you die, that's it? Steven Tiger is a thing of the past, that there is no more. You're, boom, finito. What is your take or belief?
Well, like you, the subject of my own mortality is, yes, it's something I'm aware of. I'm 74. And so I have to be aware of that. The person with the personality called Steve Tiger, that's gone. When I die, that is no more. But and I'm fine with that. That I don't have any sense that I have to go on. One of the things that I just mentioned briefly that is kind of sad that I find among many religious believers is their sense that unless I live forever, the whole universe is pointless. No, it isn't. Or let's say that if the universe is pointless, it has nothing to do with when whether it is or isn't pointless has nothing to do with whether any individual lives forever. That to me is an alien thought. But very quickly getting back to my idea of cosmic mindfulness, and I mentioned that if it is the repository of all knowledge and thought and experience of all sentient beings that have ever lived and are living and will ever live in the universe, then whatever I have learned and experienced and thought in my life becomes a facet of that evolving, emerging cosmic mindfulness. So if there is any continuity at all, it is in that form. And one of the points that I raised in the book, you may recall, is there's a Christian concept called kenosis, which refers to an emptying of self in order to be a vessel for God. All very pious sounding. But yet they view eternal life, salvation, bliss, eternal bliss in heaven. They're still themselves, their personalities, their thoughts, their preferences. And it's what I described, kind of sarcastically as endless nice weather and free widescreen TV and no annoying neighbors and 0-calorie donuts. Whereas the ideal of kenosis, of emptying to become a vessel for God, I actually think that if there's any truth at all, if there's any truth in my idea that whatever I've experienced and learned in life becomes a facet of God, I think that's a little closer to kenosis than somebody who maintains their own personality and prejudices and preferences, except they have it forever.
On my website, and also if you look on my Twitter page where I found you and your tweets on Twitter, you'll see I have a Japanese symbol. That's a symbol, that's a letter that means mu in Japan, and a famous Japanese film director named Yasujiro Ozu has it on his gravestone, and it symbolizes nothing. And his belief, and the belief of people who understand the concept of mu, is that we arise from nothing, we are for a brief time, and then we return to nothing. And that's the way it should be, that we shouldn't have immortality, because imagine a cosmos where everything lived forever. It would get awfully crowded, and Woody Allen famously said he wants to live forever, and I've always been of the mind I wouldn't want to live forever. I would get bored. You lose a certain sense of the preciousness of existence if you lived 20 quadrillion years.
Absolutely. I have said, and I meant it truthfully, I wasn't just trying to be provocative, that eternal anything, even bliss, is hellish. Yeah. It's a hellish notion.
Rod Serling-esque.
You may recall a film from the late 60s called Bedazzled, which is a kind of an updating of the Faust legend. The character who represents the devil trying to tempt the new Faust character gives him an idea of what it's like to be in heaven, in paradise, because theoretically that's where Lucifer was, one of the angels in heaven. And so he has the Faust character dance around him singing his praises. So the Lucifer character is playing God, and he has Faust. Says, all right, you're in heaven, praise me. Go on, keep praising me. Go on, keep praising me. And so after a few minutes, the Faust character is getting bored. So, well, what am I just supposed to keep doing this? And Lucifer says, yeah, now you understand how I felt after an eternity of doing that.
Well, one of the reasons I do these interviews is that hopefully people in the future will look back and see that we were not all as benighted as they might think with global
Yes.
warming and all the wars and whatnot. And so I thank you for spending a little over an hour talking about it and leaving a little bit of essence of yourself. Anyone who's interested in finding out more about you, I will link to your Rationality and Faith website. It'll be below this video. People can click there and link. So I want to thank you, Stephen Tiger. Do you have any final thing you want to say, or shall we end it here?
No, I think I've said quite enough. I very much appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to have had this discussion with you. Thank you.